Hello all, this is Al Finch. I am back to bring you a field guide to field guides. What does I mean by that? Well, a lot of folks end up in a situation like this. They are the referee or the dungeon master for their game, and they find that their players are generally so experienced that they can't be surprised by things that they find in their traditional monster manual. So they've got to come up with different types of things, different types of encounters that their players haven't seen before. Well, I'm going to give you suggestions today for various different types of role playing games, sources of different types of creatures that your party can encounter in their games that they won't find in the traditional monster manuals. Dungeons and Dragons has an awful lot of monster manuals that are published. So, you might not have much difficulty in finding a monster manual for that game that your players might not be familiar with. But just in case, I am going to give you a few recommendations for the traditional Dungeons and Dragons game. Of course, we do have field guides for Dungeons and Dragons already available. They're typically aimed at younger people. Uh, in case you're not familiar what I mean by field guide, these are often books that will talk about creatures and monsters, but don't have specific game related stats. In the case of Dungeons and Dragons, they have their Young Adventurers guides, which talk about monsters and creatures that you can normally encounter in Dungeons and Dragons style games, and they don't give you stats, but just kind of an overview of what that creature is like, if they have a culture, how you might end up dealing with them. So that's what I also mean by field guide. They're not so much of a monster manual as kind of an outline of the culture or maybe the ecology of the creature. And I kind of like it when they don't give you the statistics. I like being able to take the basic idea of the creature and then adjust it to the game that I need without having to think about the stats too much. I personally feel like it's pretty easy to assign statistics. And, if your group's not playing at a particular level, they might not encounter certain monsters very often, right? Like the fire giant in the traditional Dungeons and Dragons game, they may not run across too often until the higher levels if you want them to survive the encounter. If you completely ignore the traditional setup for the fire giant that you find in the monster manual, you can lower the power of these creatures. You can make it appropriate for what your characters are prepared to deal with. And they might not expect to see a fire giant at level 5, and so, yeah, we'll see if they end up being afraid to engage with them because of their assumed knowledge. In any case, the Young Adventurers guides are pretty cool, especially if you have some younger Dungeons and Dragons players. They might actually enjoy reading about the creatures that they encounter. It makes the game a little more predictable to them, but doesn't go so far as to give away like their statistics if you do end up using the monster manual. Another resource that I like to use for kind of regular fantasy Dungeons and Dragons style games, Dungeons and Drawings. This does again have a lot of the same types of creatures that you might be used to seeing in Dungeons and Dragons, but they give you kind of a different take on what they're like. So, here's a cockatrice. There is a statistic for cockatrice in the Dungeons and Dragons official monster manuals, but if you want to have it be an unpredictable version of the cockatrice, you might check out this book and see different variations on monsters that people might be familiar with that you can employ in your game. I'm going to tackle some other genres now. Maybe you've got less of a high fantasy game, and maybe it's more based in the real world. So let me go fetch those books for you to check out. All right, so here's an example of a game that is based in real world or earth based game settings. Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Many of you might know I am an author that have worked with this company before. A lot of their game settings are set in like the early modern period of Earth. And so it's kind of fun to have creatures that are familiar to Earth in these kinds of games, especially if you're doing some globe trotting. I like to bring in things that come from books that tell you where the monsters are located culturally on Earth. This is a child's book. It's called The Atlas of Monsters and Ghosts. It's from Lonely Planet Kids. And this one I find interesting because it tells you a lot about creatures that thrive in different parts of the earth. All right. Culturally, the stories for these creatures come from specific locations. So, for instance, you could, if you've got adventure set in real world Asia, we have stories in this book based on different parts of Asia. So if you find your characters visiting one of these locations or based at one of these locations, you could look up that creature in this book and make sure that it is something that is potentially encountered. So a lot of these are creatures that, unless you're from that area, you might not be familiar with. Some of them do appear in traditional Dungeons and Dragons monster manuals. The Rakshasa, hope I'm pronouncing that right, is in the monster manual, but you might not see some of the others in here. Orang, Bati, Pokong, the Mananana, Gal. These are not necessarily going to be typical Dungeons and Dragons fare, but they are, from actual stories told in cultures here on the real Earth. So it can add a hint of realism to those Earth-based games. Another book that I like that fits this mold is from the World's Worst Monsters and Villains. There's actually a line of these. Uh, they're a scholastic book, again, another kids book. And find a lot of kids books that deal with monsters. Uh, they like to tie it in, to actual real world stories in geography. And this book does that. All right. Here is an entry on the ghoul. Again, it is a common D&D creature that you can find in the monster manual. But if you want it to be more culturally accurate, you might look at this kind of story. And here there's even a map that points out the specific spot where some of these stories are told. Um, this kind of book helped me when I was writing up my adventure Big Puppet. You might recognize the Lambton Worm, which is based on stories that are out of Great Britain. So, highly recommend this as a potential source of monsters. All right, we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about field guides that can help you find creatures for modern horror. All right, so what do I mean by modern horror? We're talking about things like the ever popular Call of Cthulhu. When we're talking about, modern, this is relatively speaking, Call of Cthulhu, obviously, a lot of people will play this set in the 1920s or 30s, or the late 1800s, but some folks will also play it kind of X-Files style, where it's set in the more present day. Obviously, there are field guides and bestiaries for Call of Cthulhu. One of the cooler ones that I've encountered is Peterson's Field Guide to the Lovecraftian Horror. This is actually the one that kind of inspired this segment. I was looking at it and thinking, yeah, this would be really cool if I talked about other sources of creatures. Again, no statistics, but details of the habitat where they're found, their life and habits, that common behaviors. Um, Again, if you're a big fan of the source material, you'll probably know a lot of this stuff. Um, So, you may want to go outside through the traditional Lovecraftian um, monster books and field guides if you want to surprise your players. How do you surprise them in modern horror? I would say something like SCPs. Now, these things are all over the internet. They were popular a few years back, as I recall. You see a ton of YouTube videos on them. And there happens to be journals that were put together as part of a collaboration where they collected a lot of these stories and placed them into a book where they described these really bizarre creatures and items sometimes that behave in very mysterious ways. So I highly recommend checking out SCP journals if they're available. Otherwise, you can find a lot of the same material on the internet looking up SCPs. They're almost always designated by using a number of some time. Um, I believe, it's based on the study, contain, protect, or no, secure, contain, protect protocols. So it's very much in that Lovecraftian exploration of the unknown, or X Files exploration if you're playing in those style games. And they're often, written up with the more modern sensibilities and timelines, although some of them I suspect could go and be used in classical high fantasy games as well. All right, so now we're going to move on into field guides for whimsical or dream realities. All right, so if you are playing a game that's based in a more whimsical setting, maybe you're doing something based on like Alice in Wonderland, like Dungeon Land or the Land Beyond the Magic Mirror. These modules for old school Dungeons and Dragons, they've got statistics for things like, the Mad Hatter and March Hare. Many people are very familiar with um, Alice in Wonderland. So part of the fun is recognizing the creatures in this. Uh, but sometimes you still want to have surprises, right? Maybe you're playing in a setting and it's not just a one shot. Maybe you're in something like a Red and Pleasant Land from the Lamentations line. This is a setting where we're dealing with, combination of Dracula meets, um, Alice in Wonderland. Um, if you need to come up with creatures that fit into this setting thematically but aren't familiar, maybe people have read Alice in Wonderland, right? Or Dracula. You're not going to easily surprise them with traditional sources, traditional creatures from those settings that are mentioned in the books. I would recommend this little field guide. Um, it's called Fire on the Velvet Horizon, um, done by Patrick Stewart, with drawings by Scrap Princess. And like many of the other field guides, there's no actual statistics in here, but there's some very flavorful and bizarre descriptions of creatures and beings that I think would fit right into kind of a dreamscape or a Wonderland or an Oz, Wizard of Oz type setting. They're just so strange, so bizarre. You'll basically be able to take people off guard pretty easily by incorporating these into your game, and I think they'll often fit in. Some of these entries might fit into the more Lovecraftian themes too. Some of these field guides, I think, can be useful for multiple styles of games. So I highly recommend this one for somebody that just needs wild creatures. Maybe you're doing something where you're visiting like strange alien dimensions. I know Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is starting to come back. So if you're doing a game where you're actually going to different realities, this also might be a good book to help you out. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about field guides for prehistoric adventures. All right, so as often as occurs in Dungeons and Dragons and other games, we like to incorporate prehistoric elements. You maybe play a module like the Isle of Dread, where you're likely to encounter dinosaurs on an island. Well, as cool as dinosaurs are, they are something that you know people are pretty familiar with. If you talk with any kid, they can probably rattle off 10 different dinosaurs and fun facts about them. So, throwing dinosaurs at a party, that can be cool for the recognition factor. But again, if you're in a prehistoric setting and you want to surprise folks, you may want to go with something a little different. An actual setting that people can play around in that's not just a single module might include the World of the Lost, also in the Lamentations of the Flame Princess line. Um, Again, it's got dinosaurs in the back of the book that people are familiar with, and some little surprises too. But if you need more variety, if you really want to throw people off, you might include something from this book, which is The New Dinosaurs. This might be harder to track down these days, but it's kind of an alternate evolution, like how people might enjoy alternative history sometimes. Well, The New Dinosaurs is like a field guide to dinosaurs that never existed, but would have if the extinction event hadn't occurred. It goes by region, so it talks about different areas of the earth and shows dinosaurs as they might appear in those regions, um, perhaps if they had survived up to present day. You'll find a lot of the dinosaur forms in here are heavily based on animals that we're used to seeing, but they're still clearly dinosaurs, right? You can use this to throw a little variety in your game where dinosaurs are commonly encountered. Maybe you're tired of your typical T Rex. Maybe you want to throw in a cutlass tooth or the bizarre looking gourmands. That'll throw the players off when they encounter things that look like what they're used to but aren't quite the same. Also, in prehistoric settings, if you're a big fan of visiting places like museums, right, you might check out books that they offer in there about prehistoric times. Many people are familiar with dinosaurs, but maybe they're less familiar with the prehistoric animals that followed the dinosaurs. If you've got something that you're playing and it's maybe more set into actual caveman times, right? Prehistoric, but with people still around. You might want to take a look at some of these books about animals that were alive during that time period. This is one that I happened to pick up when I was visiting out west in the La Brea tar pits in the museum that was near that area. And it kind of goes into great detail about the kinds of animals that they were found trapped in the pits. So we do have some entries for this in the classic monster manual, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that maybe you weren't aware of and maybe didn't get as much attention. The giant ground sloth is one of my favorites. All right, now we're going to tackle field guides for high level or godlike play. I know not many people that play things like Dungeons and Dragons get their characters up to high level, but there are games designed around that. Some of the classics might include the games that came out of the Wrath of the Immortals playset. Um, Here, where you go beyond the levels in the traditional player's handbook, you have player characters that have ascended to the level of actual gods and demigods. It's sometimes really hard to come up with monsters that can offer a challenge at that level. Um, some of the ways that you can deal with that, might be looking at some fiction, right, that has gigantic or earth-shattering monsters. Oh, here's another adventure that features monsters. at the kind of earth-shattering level, the Earth incubation crisis, and the escape from Skullcano Island are both adventures and settings where we'll often see gigantic creatures that regular players generally just try and avoid. Although there are equalizers, right? One of the cool things is if your characters aren't ready to fight with gigantic creatures, you might offer them up a mech suit or something along those lines to help them deal with it. So a Pacific Rim kind of art book or kind of a film book can be a great resource, not only of creatures, all right, but of things that can be equalizers like mech suits. Maybe you're playing a game where it's aimed at Power Rangers style battles. I know there's a Power Rangers RPG out there. Well, here we have examples of different kinds of giant robot battle suits, but there's also examples of the monsters that you might end up fighting in these battles. So maybe your players are in mech suits, or maybe they're just godlike and strong. These are kinds of creatures that you'll want them facing off against. Um, Maybe the ones from Pacific Rim aren't your cup of tea. You want something a little more fanciful. You can always go into Godzilla. Now, I know Godzilla is pretty well known, and some of the monsters that he's fought with in the American film are well known. But the nice thing is that he's got over 30 years worth of film, and some of the monsters that we see in the more modern movies we haven't seen in a while in pop culture. Unless you're a big, huge Godzilla fan that loves all of the Japanese movies, you might not be aware of, say, things like Batra, which is like an evil counterpart to Mothra. Maybe you don't know about Destroya. Maybe you don't know about Megaguirus. Okay, and so a Godzilla encyclopedia of some kind might help out considerably when you're trying to find twists on new, gigantic, powerful monsters. Another possibility is looking at old, pulpy type comic fiction. There's a lot of DK kind of field guides to Marvel characters and DC characters. And back in the day, before Marvel really got into superheroes, they had a whole bunch of monster based comics. And so this is a nice overview of monsters that appeared in the comic books, many of which are Godzilla level threats, gigantic monsters that threaten tiny people. And these are old school enough, most people will not have heard of them. So, yeah, if you're playing godlike games where you need titanic creatures, gigantic beasts that your characters need to take out, this is a good place to find them. All right, let's now talk a little bit about field guides for animal games. All right, what do I mean by animal games? Well, there's some games where you're literally playing an animal, like Be Like a Cat. Literally, you take on the role of an alley cat or a house cat, or maybe an animal like a rabbit, the old classic Bunnies and Burrows game that was kind of based on the book Watership Down. These are things where you're in a more mundane setting, right? And so you've got characters dealing with stuff like weasels or foxes and raccoons. But maybe you need something a little more exotic, different, hard to recognize. Um, Another game that heavily relies on um, animal types too might be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness. I know this just got re-released. A great resource for this are a lot of traditional field guides, the literal field guides that they have put out for nature lovers. One that I use, not so much a field guide, but a cool thing, is the Macmillan Illustrated Animal Encyclopedia. This was one of the things that I got when I was a kid. My great aunt loved to gift me things like encyclopedias and dictionaries, and I thought they were boring as all get out. But when I started playing games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I realized they were a great resource, right? In this particular book, you have to go in when you're making a character, and there's a whole system for um, finding animals, okay, or creating animals. And these animals, okay, there are a lot of, common stuff. But you can create a mutant bulldog or a mutant sheepdog or a mutant cat. But, you wanted to, right? You could also create mutant opossums. And they do a pretty good job of kind of covering a wide variety of animals in the book. But you are also given directions for finding other animals and turning them into player characters and villains in that game. Um, and when you've got an animal encyclopedia like this, okay, you have all types of weird animals that people may not have encountered or even thought of before. And these are all real creatures. So, these are fun too for most real world settings. Um, you've got tons and tons of variety in here, descriptions of the animals, their habits, where they live. And, some of them are downright bizarre. Okay. Things that you can find here on Earth that people aren't aware of for one reason or the other, maybe because they're rare or just don't live in the part of the world where these creatures occur. So I recommend finding one of these animal encyclopedias and using it as a resource. I mean, look at that. Have any of you ever seen a ratfish before? I keep finding new stuff hiding in the pages of this thing all the time. So, again, a great resource for your games that need real animals, but you still want to surprise people. All right. Next thing that we're going to take care of is post apocalyptic games. All right. So, if we're going to talk about post apocalyptic settings, many of you are probably familiar with things like Gamma World, right? The original TSR game. There are analogs to it available these days, like Mutant Future. And then, if you're into the Turtles game, you might be aware of some of their post apocalyptic expansions as well, things like Roadhogs and After the Bomb. So, post apocalyptic stuff. One of the neater things I've encountered that might help with that is more speculative kind of bestiary or field guides. This is by the same guy that did the new dinosaurs. It's called After Man, a zoology of the future. So, again, they're looking at potential evolution of creatures that are alive today and what they turn into. It does a lot of the same stuff that the New Dinosaurs book does. It talks about the geography and where these creatures live, and many of them are familiar yet slightly off. Um, so you'll see a lot of fantastic creatures that you might think of as mutations, right? Things that could exist um, in a post-apocalyptic landscape um, where the, the the world has changed, and so the animals that live in it have changed as well. So, highly recommend checking out future bestiaries like Afterman if you can find it. Another good source for post apocalyptic is just looking at world books for post apocalyptic games. There's video games like Fallout, and there's old board games like this. This is Gamma Marauders. They'll often have world books associated with these things. My old world book here gives details of factions that exist um, that have created giant bionic beasts So this is also a potential crossover with the Godzilla level play with the giant monsters. Here, I strongly recommend checking out the world books for post-apocalyptic games for resources as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about sci-fi and fantasy next. All right, so I am certain that there are many of you that have Star Trek and Star Wars games that you like to play, and people that play those games know the bestiaries, the creatures that populate those worlds pretty well. I've got a handful of games here that are based on Star Wars and Star Trek. Things like White Star, which is a science fiction role playing based on more of a old white box Dungeons and Dragons engine. Similarly, we have Starships and Spacemen, which is looking more Star Trek than Star Wars than White Star is. And of course, we've got our classic Spelljammer setting, which in the new set, for all of the drawbacks and problems that people had with it, did also have kind of a cool bestiary, but still, you want to surprise people when they're playing science fiction, science fantasy type stuff. What would be helpful? Well, again, cinema guidebooks, or maybe books that cover creatures from literature that aren't related. This is one of my favorites, Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials. This is a guy who read a whole bunch of old pulpy science fiction and some of the classics too, things like Dune. Um, and then, as an artist, decided he would illustrate what the aliens in the classic science fiction books would look like. You'll probably see more of this later on my channel. I am using this as kind of a guide to my own reading. I'm going through the list of books that these aliens are in and reading the books. But it's kind of cool to see what, to this artist's eye, these aliens appeared. So, there are lots of descriptions of creatures that were, in famous storylines, but maybe aren't very well known today. And they fit in, I think, very well to spacefaring settings, things where you're doing Star Trek, Star Wars, maybe the old Traveler or Spelljammer settings. Lots of aliens from more classic science fiction literature that fewer players might be familiar with today. So, highly recommend Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials if you can find it. But there's, a lot of old fiction picture books that I think are worthwhile if you can't find this one. All right, let's tackle superheroes next. All right, so I'm well aware that there are a number of superhero based role playing games, but this is the one that, I've played and I have in my collection, the old TSR Marvel Superheroes game. Um, the nice thing about many of these games is they allow you to create your own hero, but maybe, you want to base it on something. Well, they give you guidelines for many of the more popular heroes and villains in these sets, but they can't cover them all. And if you want to find more obscure entries, um, heroes and villains that maybe if you're not a comic book fan, you won't know, you might take a look at things like the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, or its equivalent with DC, which is the DC's Who's Who. I know these have been collected a number of times, but there are individual issues for these things that when they were first printed. And what they do is, they give you a thorough description of characters that appear in the comics, many of which are fairly obscure, or maybe they're older forms or older costumes, right? I don't know that many of you would recognize Ariel as being a previous incarnation of Kitty Pryde, also known as like Shadowcat or Sprite. Um, they give fine descriptions of their powers, where they're from, their equipment, There's even things like alien races in these books, so they can be helpful when you're talking about sci-fi settings too. Um, they'll often give you a roster of heroes, so a particular team you're trying to represent, but you want them to see an alien. A lot of people know the Avengers these days, but they may not have seen people like Star Fox, except into that one credit in one of those more present day films, or Jocasta, or the original Captain Marvel, or the sidekick Rick Jones. Okay, so they'll often give a description of powers and how strong they are, although they're not always entirely accurate. This dude's a classic villain that faces off with Namor all the time. Um, when he's in the air, it says he can lift 4 tons, but when he's underwater, he can lift 40,000 tons. I don't think that that's canon in the books these days, but it's still kind of hilarious to see how much some of these characters could possibly lift if they were alive and, i.e., real. They've got villains mixed in with heroes, but frankly, if you're playing a classic Marvel style game, heroes are going to be fighting heroes almost as often as they're fighting the villains anyway. So almost any character in here could be an interesting challenge for your superhero characters, um, your players to face off against in a superhero character based game. So again, I highly recommend the official handbook to the Marvel Universe and its DC equivalent in Who's Who. You can also look for the DK books, the one that I mentioned earlier about monsters. There are DK books that are very much like the Marvel Universe handbooks. Um, that are a little easier to find and pick up these days. So, again, a good resource. And if you want something, if you've got powerful characters, these monster books, they're good for powerful superheroes that are on the level of Thor and the Hulk to face off against. All right, last but not least, let's talk about some kid games and the field guides that can help you there. Okay, so maybe you've got a game going, or at least you're trying to start a game with some younger folks. Games like No Thank You Evil might be a place where you get your start. Kind of a whimsical game based on the imagination of children, where anything that they can imagine can be in the game. Or maybe you're looking at Magical Kitties, Save the Day, where they're animal based again. Some of the stuff that I've showed you before can be useful for games like Magical Kitties and No Thank You Evil. The more whimsical field guides can help with these more whimsical games, and the ones that deal with real life Earth with animals that maybe you are used to encountering, things like the Animal Encyclopedia might be helpful in the Magical Kitties Save the Day. But there's other sources, right, that I think I should also mention that go well with games like this. Um, uh, One of them is if you're playing a more kid-oriented style high fantasy game, is the Baby Bestiary. All right. This gives a description of what it's like to encounter and care for more traditional Dungeons and Dragons style monsters, centaurs, Cerberus, cockatrice. Um, they're represented in, kind of a cute form. If kids decide they want to have pets that they want to care for, baby dragons. There's a lot of nice descriptions in here on how to raise and train these kind of creatures, and I think it's a good fit for child or youth oriented games where the kids might think it would be really cool to have an animal or a monster sidekick that they are taking care of. In a similar light, right? Maybe you're doing something more Pokemon style. I know that there are games that are literal like analogs to Pokemon in Dungeons and Dragons. The Battle Zoo Eldamon has a ton of Pokemon creatures in the back. All right, but if you want to use actual Pokemon in this game, there's a whole bunch of Pokemon field guides out there that give you thorough descriptions of actual Pokemon. It's kind of the reverse. Maybe you don't want to surprise your kids with weird stuff. Maybe kids want to be more engaged with things they're familiar with. So maybe grabbing a field guide will help you make your Dungeons and Dragons style Pokemon game a little more appealing to the kids you're working with. So don't forget that video games are essentially a good source. If you get video game world books and guides, they can be used to surprise your players or uh, make them excited because they recognize stuff. Maybe they don't know mythology as well as they know more things like God of War or something along those lines. All right. So that, I believe, is about it. Oh, I should show you these too. Maybe you've got kid oriented mystery games. Um, this is the Gravity Falls Volume 3 or Journal 3. It's a recent, relatively speaking, recent kid show where their main characters are, like 12 years old and they're solving bizarre mysteries, X Files style. They're encountering weird creatures. Books based on these more recent kid shows um, can go a far way in providing some very interesting creatures and encounters in your games. Um, Same token, if you're a fan of the old school Scooby Doo, there are guides to the old Scooby Doo shows that describe every monster in those old shows. Those are well worth looking up as well if you're doing a more X Files oriented kids themed game. All right, there we go. Now I believe I've shown off everything that I wanted to show. Hopefully, you enjoyed I kind of overview of field guides, these kind of source books that aren't typically associated with role playing games. They can be used as inspiration for a lot of the things that we do as referees, and it can be useful for either surprising your players or maybe bringing them in with something more familiar. All right. Well, thank you for watching and catch you next time.